Well, we've talked a bit about reflection here, and a question that I like to ask all of my guests, so I'll ask you both in turn, is to reflect, actually. So, what, we'll start with you, Peter. Have you changed your mind about in the course of your life, something you might have previously thought was a unshakable certainty, or perhaps even something you changed your mind about recently? And what was it that made you think differently?
I think the thing that has changed my understanding of the world is actually looking at demographic patterns, uh, which I didn't really reflect on. The single most extraordinary fact that came out of the research that we did for the book, um, to me, I'm sure other people knew this perfectly well, but I did not, was the fact that up until about 1830 or 1840, between 30 and 50% of European children were dying in childhood. Born European children were still dying in childhood. A staggering 50% in Germany in the 1830s of children don't make it into adulthood. Um, and I checked that with one of my 19th century colleagues, because I found that very surprising that Germany would be worse than Britain and France, where it was only 30. But they said, yeah, no, that's right, because eastern parts of Germany were very poor agricultural areas as late as 1830. That does make sense, that death rates would be even higher there. So this first demographic transition is healthcare, inoculation, etc., and all these children survive. And so between 1850 and 1900, people are still having massive families. My grandfather was one of 11 children, and they all survived to adulthood. So around 1900, you've got Europeans breeding like rabbits still, because they still think all their children are going to die, but they're all surviving. And this is the era of, obviously, Western colonization across the planet. You have far more Europeans in that era than at any other era of time, because it takes 2 generations or a generation and a half before people realize their children are surviving, and you don't have to have children anymore. And there's enough wealth so your children are not supporting you in retirement. But anyway, the great era of Western colonization is associated with that first demographic transition. But then we get the second demographic transition. And this is the thing that I think people are not thinking about clearly enough. What it means if instead of the canonical 2.1 children, your adult women are only having on average 1.5 or 1.6 children. That is a huge game changer. And it's hidden because our populations are not declining yet, because better healthcare means that people are living longer. So you're not seeing it in total population figures, but it is changing the ratios within your population. And I think it's kind of understanding that has made me realize that the sort of there's two moving parts to the modern world that make it different from the world that I grew up in. One is the shift of manufacturing to the periphery, but the second is the shifting demographic pattern within our own societies. And we have to square the circle and work out where the shifting of these two things leads us. What is our best logical response to these two mega changes? And they are both mega changes.
Yeah, in answer to the question, what have I changed my mind about? I mean, I'm tempted to say I've finally given up on my annual ritual of saying next season will be Manchester United's good season. But I think for taking up where Peter left off more profoundly, this issue of the demographic transition, which is part of a series of questions we sort of only just raised at the end of the book, but we just decided it wasn't, the book didn't allow us to possibly investigate. The other one we do refer to is climate change. But this is something I give a lot of thought to, and I spend a lot of time researching and actually writing about these issues. And I think the one possibility, I've always been very dismissive, as we both have been, of those who talk about civilization collapse. Look at what happened to Rome, it's going to happen to the West. And we're saying that's utter nonsense. But the possibility of complete civilization collapse, of human civilization now, not Western civilization, is one that I'm actually being forced to entertain for the first time, because these are not insurmountable problems, but they do take human will to face and to confront. I mean, how do you maintain endless growth with a declining population? And what if, technology doesn't provide a solution? I mean, many of my colleagues are optimists who say, don't worry, it's all going to be solved by AI, but they don't produce much evidence to that effect. It's really just an expression of hope. And, I keep going back to Robert Solow's famous statement, the computer age is everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. We heard the same thing about the internet. We heard the same thing about computers. Productivity growth has been trending downwards ever since. And the kind of examples that I get of how artificial intelligence will revolutionize human productivity are based on assumptions, and also, I think, in some cases, mistaken models. They're based on a human calculus-based model of human decision making, in which you can actually create an even more intelligent human. But again, the research economists are not great at researching outside their field, and a lot of the research, as I understand it, and neurobiology says it's a lot more complicated, the way the human mind operates, and there's quite a body of literature that says the human body is fundamental. The way we acquire knowledge is the human body plays a fundamental role, and none of this is being captured in this sort of idea that you can create super intelligent humans or super intelligent robots. All of which to say that if we're on a path and our solution is don't worry, technology is somehow going to rescue us, but it hasn't yet, I think we have to start saying, well, what happens if it doesn't rescue us and we continue on this path? What happens if we have to acquire the capacity to extend human life to, the kind of lengths they're talking about, but human productivity doesn't increase at that rate? Are we going to create a society of sort of serfs and aristocrats and, a very small privileged elite living off the labors of those who don't have the luxury of retiring at 65? And we see that. I see that around me in Western societies, where you see people who are working well into their retirement, having to take second jobs because their pension isn't sufficient, and in some cases physically demanding jobs that are running down their health. We're seeing widening gaps in life expectancy within Britain because of this sort of thing. So some people living the best lives, and other people essentially supporting them in the style to which they've grown accustomed. And I think these are unsustainable trajectories. We have to face up to these as a society, and if we don't, I think there is a real danger that you could, and what path that goes on, I can't say, but I don't think we can just assume that we don't have to take tough decisions because somehow we're going to be rescued by a deus ex machina of technology. I think until that technology actually proves itself that it can do this, we have to err on the side of caution, and I think begin confronting these decisions now. And in Western societies, I see very little of that. I see a lot of, either dooms, on the one hand, there's sort of the doom mongers, and on the other hand, the optimists, but not someone in the middle saying, well, we have the capacity to do it, but we have to have the will and make the decisions. And, I'm hearing very little of that, certainly in political discourse and even in journalistic discourse. Whether or not other societies are more open to that task, that's a possibility. But that is a concern of mine, that we could just sort of end up in denial, not facing with any of, not dealing with any of these issues while things, and certainly to listen to my colleagues in climate science, it gets worse by the year. And and I'm guilty of this myself sometimes, and I focus on all the benefits of the energy transition. But when you look at the aggregate data, yes, we're electrifying the world economy and shifting to renewables very quickly, but our aggregate consumption of fossil fuels still keeps going up, because growth is rising faster than the transition can keep up. And is that sustainable? Well, according to my colleagues in climate science, no. And we're getting very close to a crunch point. And yet, I here in Canada, you can have wildfires, bringing the economy to a halt. And people still talk about how, don't worry, next season will be better. And sort of like my hope for Manchester United. At some point, you have to say, well, you're not going to be rescued by a new signing. I think that's the main thing I would say, is that I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, because I'm not. But I think for the first time, I'm really starting to say we may really have been the beneficiaries of an extraordinary time in human history, but that might not be the model for all human history. And maybe we should actually take a step back and think of, do we need real deeper imagination?